BYU Cougars are having a season to remember, to say the least. Arguably their best season since their national championship run all the way back in 1984. And although this year has been quite the surprise to just about everyone, BYU is no stranger to winning in college football. This is a program that over the past 50 years has prided itself on doing more with less than any other team in the country. Because despite being a private religious school in Provo, Utah that has a strict honor code for all of its players, this is still a program that ranks 11th all-time in wins since 1970, trailing Notre Dame by just one game. But the craziest part is, it wasn't always like this. This program was rescued by one innovative and creative head coach who pulled this school from the depths of mediocrity and led them to the top of the college football mountain. And in the process forever altered the sport that we all know and love today. This is the story of legendary head coach Lavell Edwards. BYU first officially kicked off back in 1922 as members of the Rocky Mountain Conference. And through the first 50 years or so, BYU was bad. Like really bad, like only recording a couple dozen winning seasons in their first 50 years as a program bad. They had won one single conference championship and 0 bowl game appearances. Granted, back then there was only like 8 bowl games, so there wasn't any Snoop Dogg Arizona Bowl for a 6-6 team to go to. But on top of all of that, they had a 5-42 record against their rival up north and had been through 6 different head coaches within the span of 15 years leading up to 1972. By all measurable standards, not good at all. And sadly, without much hope of anything changing anytime soon. And this is because of a number of different reasons. One of them being that back in the day, the game was played much differently. The run game dominated. Running backs were actually the most coveted position in the sport, and they had won 17 of 24 Heismans between the years of 1965 and 1988. The Heisman Trophy itself is modeled after running back Ed Smith. That being said, BYU was a small private religious school. They didn't exactly have the resources or talent pool to compete with that style of play. So after a decade of coaches coming in and out of the program, BYU turned their sights on longtime assistant coach Lavell Edwards. This was Lavell's first shot at a head coaching gig, and right away he knew that if he was going to last, drastic changes were needed. Because in his words, it wasn't a case of if I was going to get fired, it was just a matter of when. And he had to think a little bit outside of the box, so he turned his sights on other teams in the country that were having success but facing the same obstacles as BYU. Stanford had gone to back-to-back Rose Bowls by passing. I looked at Stanford and I looked at us, and I knew that with us being a private school with the limitations we have on recruiting, we had to do something differently. And it wouldn't take long for him to realize that if the Cougars had any shot at competing in college football, they would have to do one thing and do it better than anyone else in the country. That was throw the ball. He also drew back to the one season that BYU was able to claim a conference championship back in 1965. Virgil Carter was the quarterback at the time, and the Cougars were able to find success leveraging his strengths with a precise, well-timed passing attack. In 1966, Virgil Carter had thrown for 2,200 yards, which was more than Heisman winner Steve Spurrier the year prior. Now, Lavell's first order of business as head coach was revamping the offensive playbook. So he brought in a man by the name of Dewey Warren, aka the Swamp Rat. Dewey was the first quarterback in Tennessee history to throw for over 1,000 yards in a season and was drafted by the Cincinnati Bengals. So why is that important? Well, at that time, the Cincinnati Bengals had a legendary head coach on their offensive staff by the name of Bill Walsh, who was largely credited with developing the pass-happy West Coast offense, an offensive scheme specifically designed for short, precise passing to running backs and tight ends, a scheme pretty much unheard of at the time. Well, when the Bengals star quarterback went down with injury mid-season, they were forced to make a trade for former BYU quarterback Virgil Carter. And while very athletic and accurate with his throws, he didn't have the strongest arm by NFL standards. But Bill Walsh and the offensive staff were able to magnify his skills with this West Coast offense. It allowed him to roll out of the pocket and find his running backs and receivers in open space in the intermediate passing game, which allowed Carter to lead the league in completions that year and finished third in overall passing yards. Well, Lavell saw the success that the Bengals had with Virgil Carter and knew he needed someone familiar with that offensive scheme to come and revamp BYU's offense. So Dewey Warren, the Swamp Rat, was brought in to install this similar passing attack where pretty much every position on the field was going to be catching passes. So now with the offense installed and Lavell at the cockpit, it didn't take long for things to take flight in Provo. Now it wasn't instant, but it would take a couple years of tinkering for things to get going, and the first quarterback to really take off in the passing game was Gary Scheide. In 1974, he led the Cougars on a 7-game winning streak, giving the school its second conference championship and its first bowl appearance. It would also mark the first time the Cougars were ranked in the AP poll at number 20. Scheide would be awarded the Sammy Baugh Trophy as the nation's top quarterback and was drafted into the NFL by guess who? The Cincinnati Bengals. After just 2 seasons as head coach, Lavell Edwards had given BYU its best year in school history, but things were only just getting started. The following season, Gifford Nelson would burst onto the scene. His junior year, he led the Cougars to their first ever 9-win season and a ranking of 17 in the country. The following year, the Cougs started out the season dominating the competition, outscoring their first 3 opponents in the season 158-25. They would climb as high as 13 in the country and started gaining the nickname Pass U. Sadly, we never got to see that team's full potential as Gifford Nelson would go down with an injury the 4th game of the season against Oregon State, although he would go on to be drafted in the 3rd round to the Houston Oilers. Mark Wilson was the next man off the bench once Nelson went down, and in his first start against Colorado State, he threw for 7 touchdowns and ran in 1 more. His senior year, he led the Cougars to a perfect 11-0 regular season record, and the team was ranked 9th in the country. They would suffer a last-second loss against Indiana in their bowl game, but Wilson finished his career setting an NCAA record for total offense and finished 3rd in the Heisman voting. He too would be drafted into the NFL 15th overall to the Oakland Raiders. Now, waiting in the wings after Wilson was all-time great Jim McMahon, who specifically went to BYU because he knew he wanted to throw the ball, because otherwise he wasn't exactly your typical BYU student. But in 1980, McMahon led the Cougars on a 17-game winning streak and an all-time classic in the 1980 Holiday Bowl against SMU, forever known to this day as the Miracle Bowl. He graduated setting a new record for total offense along with 18 other NCAA records. One NCAA statistician named Jim Van Valkenburg stated, "What Jim McMahon did is comparable to what Babe Ruth did in baseball. No quarterback in the history of college football has had a season like it. Ever." McMahon would be drafted 5th overall to the Chicago Bears and go on to win them a Super Bowl. So how would BYU follow that up? Well, with a guy by the name of Steve Young. In 1983, BYU had one of the most high-flying offensive performances in NCAA history, averaging 584 yards a game and outscoring opponents 505-244. After losing their first game of the year to the Baylor Bears, the Cougars would go on to dismantle just about every other team on their schedule, finishing the season 11-1 and ranked 7th in the country. Young finished 2nd in the Heisman voting that year and would be drafted number 1 overall to the LA Express, and would go on to be Super Bowl MVP for the 49ers. Now, surely by now, BYU was due to come back down to earth. And they had a nice decade, but it couldn't last forever. Robbie Bosco was the following act, and he's on record stating, "I didn't even want to get out of bed. It almost felt overwhelming following those All-Americans. I didn't want to be the one who broke the string." So with all of that pressure on his back to perform and live up to this insane standard of BYU quarterbacks before him, what does Robbie do? He leads the Cougars to an undefeated 1984 season capped off with a win against Michigan in the Holiday Bowl to be crowned college football national champions. From then on, BYU would officially be known as the Quarterback Factory. Truly a run for the ages. And as the years went on, the wins and the accolades continued to stack up for Lavell Edwards, and his influence on the game just continued to grow. More and more teams started to adopt the pass-first mentality, and slowly but surely you started to see quarterbacks dominate the Heisman race year in and year out, including BYU's own Ty Detmer, who won it in 1990. But it wasn't just championship quarterbacks that Lavell was producing at BYU. It was also a factory for some of the brightest coaching minds in the sport, both in college and the NFL. We're talking about Super Bowl winning coaches like Andy Reid, Mike Holmgren, Brian Billick, and in the college ranks, guys like Kyle Whittingham, Doug Scoville, aka the Mad Bomber, and the late, great Mike Leach, who never actually played for BYU or coached there, but he went to school there and studied the Cougars offense as Lavell let him sit in on staff meetings with the offensive coordinators. He was obsessed with BYU's style of play and largely attributes Lavell Edwards for his inspiration in developing his own offensive scheme, the air raid. He said, "That was the perfect time for me to be around BYU." Lavell was transforming not just college football, but the NFL too. People started throwing the ball more aggressively because of the success BYU had while doing it. BYU just started to crush these teams that had more resources and better players. He changed everything. And after all was said and done, Lavell had racked up 257 wins, more than all other BYU coaches combined, and 8th all-time in the NCAA. 19 conference titles, 22 bowl games, 32 All-Americans, 7 Sammy Baugh trophies, 4 Davey O'Brien winners, 2 Outland, 1 Doak Walker, 1 Maxwell, 1 Heisman, and 4 Hall of Famers. In 2000, Lavell coached his last game in Provo at Cougar Stadium, a stadium that when he took over had a capacity of just 30,000 seats, but by the time he retired had grown to over 65,000, and was rightly renamed Lavell Edwards Stadium, truly the house that Lavell built. Lavell Edwards passed away in 2016 at the age of 86, and it's hard to overstate just how much he meant not only to BYU for drastically altering the trajectory of that program and putting them on the college football map, but also his impact on the sport as a whole. His legacy will live on not only in Provo, but across the entire football landscape for generations to come. I'll see you guys in the next video. Peace.